Welcome to Psychological Explorations with Dr. Michael Axelman and Daniela. We return once again to the brilliant San Francisco psychoanalyst Thomas Ogden and his groundbreaking paper from 1989 on the concept of an autistic-contiguous position. He dives into the most primitive area of the emergence of self, that area between birth and what Klein had referred to as the paranoid schizoid position. Ogden predates that position and discusses what this involves, which is essentially the contact boundary without any internal, without an inside. All of the action happens at the boundary. The autistic contiguous position, the psychological organization generating the most primitive state of being, which has a period of primacy earlier than the paranoid, schizoid, and depressive positions as described by Klein, yet coexists dialectically with these other positions from the beginning of psychological life. And it's important to emphasize this coexistence of being in the positions at the same time. They don't exist independently, but dialectically. Ogden extends the concept of psychological positions or organizations to include the most primitive aspects of human experience. A specific mode of attributing meaning to experience in which raw sensory data are ordered by means of forming pre-symbolic connections between sensory impressions that come to constitute bounded surfaces. More clearly defined, autistic is the designation of the most primitive psychological organization, despite the fact that the term is usually associated with a pathologically closed psychological system, which I do not feel, and this is Ogden speaking, is characteristic of the normal autistic contiguous mode. Pathological forms of autism involve hypertrophied versions of this type of defense. So he sees the autistic mode as a developmental passing through, and the pathological form a way of getting stuck there. Going to the Webster 1828 dictionary, contiguous, coming from Latin, touching, meeting, or joining at the surface or border, as two contiguous bodies or countries. Contiguous is the experience of surfaces touching one another, is a principal medium through which connections are made and organization achieved in this psychological mode. Contiguous thus provides the necessary antithesis to the connections, to the connotations of isolation and disconnectedness carried by the word autistic. I go now briefly to a case study presented by Ogden. It's one that he reported back in 1982 in a collection of papers regarding work with very difficult patients. And I quote from Ogden, "I worked for many years in intensive psychotherapy with a congenitally blind schizophrenic adolescent named Robert. In the initial years of this work, which began when the patient was 19, He spoke very little. The patient said that he was terrified of the millions of spiders that were all over the floor, his food and body. He felt that they were crawling in and out of all of his bodily openings, including his eyes, mouth, ears, nose, anus, and penis, as well as the pores of his skin. He would sit in my office trembling, with his eyes rolled back. According to the history given by the patient's parents, siblings, and other relatives, Robert's mother's handling of him as an infant was characterized by unpredictable shifts, from smothering over involvement to extremes of hatred for this child. He was left alone in a mobile crib for hours. Robert would stand up in the crib, holding on to the bar, forming its upper edge, and would propel himself around the room by rhythmically banging his head against the bar. His mother told me that he seemed oblivious to the pain, and that she was horrified by his demonical willfulness. In the period of treatment that I will be focusing upon here, Robert refused to bathe despite every act of prodding, cajoling, bribing, and threatening that the nursing staff could devise. Robert was hospitalized for the initial year of the treatment. He rarely changed his clothes, even to sleep. His hair was a mess of greasy clumps. Robert developed an intense bodily odor that silently accompanied him and which lingered after him for hours following his departure from my office. He would lie back in the soft chair of my consulting room with his greasy hair on the hard padded back of the chair. The aspect of the transference-countertransference interaction that I was most aware of at the time was the way in which I felt invaded by this patient. When he left my office, I could not feel that I had respite from him. I felt as if he had managed in a literal way to get inside of me, to get under my skin by means of his odor that was saturating my furniture, with which I had become closely identified. Ogden, wink, wink there. I eventually understood these feelings as my response to unconscious participation in a projective identification, in which the patient was engendering in me his own feelings of being painfully and unwillingly infiltrated by his internal object mother. If you're interested in more on projective identification, we do have an earlier presentation that you can find on that topic. So it's a sensation-dominated experience with the forehead banging against the bar. So vivid. Experience of sensation at the skin surface, sensory boundary, that are the principal media for the creation of psychological meaning. Touching over time generates the sense of a bounded sensory surface on which one's experience occurs. The creation of autistic shapes, written about by Tustin in 1984, and she puts it, we can attempt to create ourselves the experience of an autistic shape if we reduce the chair we are sitting in to the sensation it makes on our buttocks. The shape of that impression is idiosyncratic to each of us and changes as we shift in our seats. In healthy development, comfort, cuddling, connectedness, gentleness will be attached to the experience of shapes in the autistic-contiguous mode. More on autistic objects. An autistic object is the experience of a hard, angular sensory surface that is created when an object is pressed hard against the infant's skin. In this form of experience, the individual experiences his surface, which in a sense is all there is for him, as a hard crust or armor that protects him from the unspeakable dangers that only later will be given names. As experience is increasingly generated in the paranoid, schizoid, and depressive modes, words like armor, shell, crust, danger, attack, separateness are attached to the quality of sensory impressions created by autistic objects. Autistic contiguous experience and pathological autism. Experience at the skin surface is critically important in that it constitutes the area where there is a convergence of the infant's idiosyncratic pre-symbolic world of sensory impressions and the interpersonal world made up as objects, which an outside observer would view as having an existence separate from the infant and outside of his omnipotent control. In terms of pathological autism, no person can compete with the capacity of never-changing autistic shapes and objects to provide absolutely reliable comfort and protection. The links to obsessive-compulsive defenses more generally. Obsessive-compulsive defenses always entail the construction of tightly ordered sensory containment of experience. That is never simply symbolic, ideational ordering of experience designed to ward off, control, and express conflicted, unconscious, anoerotic wishes and fears. Obsessive-compulsive symptoms and defenses have their origins in the infant's earliest efforts at ordering and creating a sense of boundedness for his sensory experience. In comparing the nature of autistic contiguous anxiety with depressive anxiety, which is the fear that one has driven away a loved one, and paranoid schizoid anxiety, the sense of impending annihilation, which is experienced as a form of fragmenting attacks on the self and one's own objects. The anxiety about containing this ambivalence. Alternately, autistic continuous anxiety, the experience of disintegration of one's sensory surface or one's rhythm of safety, resulting in feelings of leaking. For example, saliva, tears, urine, blood, dissolving, rotting, collapsing into shapeless, unbounded space. Autistic contiguous modes of defense. Defenses generated in an autistic continuous mode are directed at the reestablishment of continuity of the bounded sensory surface and ordered rhythmicity upon which the early integrity of self rests. Within the analytic hour, patients spanning the full range of psychological maturity commonly attempt to reconstitute a sensory floor of experience by means of activities like hair twirling, foot tapping, even while lying on the couch, stroking lips, cheek or earlobe, humming, intoning, picturing or repeating a series of numbers, focusing on geometric shapes on the ceiling or the wall, or using a finger to trace shapes on the wall next to the couch. Such activities can be thought of as self-soothing uses of autistic shapes. Bick uses the phrase second skin formation to describe the way in which the individual attempts to create a substitute for a deteriorating sense of cohesiveness of the skin's surface. One may attempt to adhere to an object by means of tenacious eye contact or a steady stream of chatter in a way that is experienced as holding the parts of the sensory-dominated personality together. Ogden brings up the case of compulsive masturbation. Compulsive masturbation often serves the purpose of creating a heightened experience of a sensory surface in order to ward off feelings of loss of sensory cohesion. A female patient would masturbate for hours each day without conscious sexual fantasy. Orgasm was not the goal. When orgasm did occur, it was experienced as an unwelcome anticlimax, which ended the only part of the patient's day during which she felt alive and in one piece. And the case of procrastination. The deadline is elevated to the position of a continually felt pressure in the patient's emotional life. That can be a felt presence at every moment, whether or not the patient is consciously focused upon it. These patients describe the anxiety of the approaching deadline as a pressure that they hate and at the same time continually seem to recreate for themselves. A due date is something to push up against like a wall in front of me. Very frequently, such patients become physically ill once the task has been completed, usually at the last possible moment prior to the deadline. Experiencing such symptoms as migraine headaches, dermatitis, or somatic delusions, such symptoms can be understood as substitute efforts at maintaining a sensory surface in the absence of the containing pressure of the deadline. In closing, the autistic-continguous mode is a sensory-dominated pre-symbolic mode of generating experience, which provides a good measure of the boundedness and beginnings of a sense of the place where one's experience occurs. Anxiety in this mode consists of an unspeakable terror of the dissolution of the boundedness, resulting in feelings of leaking, falling, or dissolving into endless, shapeless space. Thank you for joining us today at Psychological Explorations as we dove into perhaps the most primitive of all modes of experience. Please come back and join us for future podcasts.